To the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It is time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub, among the ranks of knowledge seekers and the occasional Southern scholar. Jason Pentrail, James Waldo, I'm Micah Hanks. Fellas, how goes it?
Well, we've all been on the road, and now we've gathered back here at the Cross Time Pub to catch up on what's been going on. What do you got going on, James?
Gentlemen, I've never had it so good. We've been burning up the road the last couple of weeks. You and I went to the Etowah Mound show. I saw some cool things. We took some video. We talked to some cool people. Yeah, it's been good.
My only regret is that I wasn't able to be down there with you guys at the Etowah Mounds. I've always wanted to see those, and of course, any opportunity to be out in the field with you fellas is a blessing in itself. But as you know, I took to the highway, and I decided to visit my good friend, Christopher McCollum. Although, in this instance, it's kind of mandatory, especially when you are the best man in your friend's wedding, and that's exactly what my duties were. So I jumped in the car, drove to Connecticut with my guitar in tow, and attended a bit of a cultural anthropological ceremony of sorts. So you might say we were all doing something anthropologically oriented. Mine just was a little different from yours. Apart from that, guys, I've had World War II history on my mind, and I got to ask you a question real quick. If we back up to World War I, do you know why World War I was so quick?
No.
Well, it was because they were Russian. Do you know why World War II was so slow?
Tell us.
It's because they were Stalin.
My goodness.
Sorry I had to do that. But, I mean, all kidding aside, though, I did watch this 3-part documentary on Stalin. And, again, you're looking at one of the most disturbing periods in history. I mean, it was just atrocious what was going on, and yet I feel like if you really want to understand, the Second World War, if you really want to understand the Cold War, and if you really want to understand, I mean, there's so much about that applies philosophically, economically, politically, even to things going on in the world today. It's so important to be a student of history.
Absolutely. Those might be things past, but almost always there's an application for today. You can see parallels. You can see proclivity for human nature to go to the dark side in certain situations, and that's why those things are important.
Absolutely. And, again, I just want to say this, and I'm not making a political statement so much as I'm making a historical observation, but in American culture today, in the West in general, you see an awful lot of this, well, this person is, and then, name your extremist group, whether it's far right, far left. And you often see the comparison, that person is Hitler. You very seldom see the same comparison made with someone like Stalin, although many historians would argue he may have been worse, at least as bad. Yeah. However you look at it, there are a lot of parallels between those two dictators during that period in history. But really, I think, at least in terms of recent memory, and I say recent in the sense that there are plenty of veterans and people who lived through that conflict who are still alive, and they actually have a memory of it. However you look at it, it's one of the darkest periods in human history, and it shows just how bad things can get. And I see people make the comparisons, and I see people complaining these days, about, again, ideology, cultural movements, politics, and things. But when we look back through history, I mean, we've seen how bad it can get. Granted, we don't want it to get to that point again. It's been said many times that we study the past so that we don't repeat those mistakes again. And in studying history, we hope to better ourselves and be able to prevent some of those, how would we term it? Maybe some of those, we could call them humanitarian black holes that humanity has fallen into at times in the past.
And speaking of those black holes, speaking of history, speaking of politics, I had the honor and the privilege to spend about 7 hours last Friday at the Etowah Mounds in Cartersville, Georgia. And this was, the first time I'd been to one of these large Mississippian mound sites. I've, been to some other smaller ones throughout the Southeast and older sites that we saw up in Ohio during our last trip last year. But this was the first time I'd been to one of these Mississippian style sites, and it was a real eye opener. First of all, if you've never been to Etowah, it is a beautifully preserved site, absolutely gorgeous. Mound A there on the property is way larger than the pictures that you saw that I put on social media. Of course, when we do these trips, we try to get the pictures out and get some videos out so everybody can see what we're doing and what we're involved with. But I tell you, the pictures just don't do it justice. It is absolutely massive. You have the beautiful Etowah River running right there beside it. They still have the fish weir out there. And when you stand on top of Mound A, it's very easy to kind of put yourself back in time because it lends itself so well with the countryside and everything that's around the site. But a beautiful job. So I spent about 3 hours that morning just looking through the museum, reading all the signage, trying to take it all in and learn as much as I could about this culture. And then James was actually able to finish up with work and join me later on that afternoon about 2:30. He was able to get out there. So he was able to go through there and see the rest of the site with me. So we had a really good time out there. It was a beautiful day. But, that was the first time with Native American cultures that we had begun in the Mississippian time period to see more of a political angle on things and chiefdoms, things like that we had now seen a culture that had become not necessarily sedentary, but established, if you will, there on the riverbanks, and the large advent of agriculture and everything that kind of changed what we had known about indigenous people in North America up to that point. So it was if you've never been there, it's absolutely gorgeous. It's a breathtaking site, very well preserved, and they have a museum with just some of the most fantastic artifacts that you'll ever see. So that's Etowah Mounds in Cartersville. And then the next day, we were able to attend. We had a table set up at the Etowah Valley Artifact Show. And I got to tell you, this show was much larger than some of the other ones that we've attended. And I know some people question, what exactly are you guys doing at an artifact show? And really our reason for being there is kind of twofold. One is to let people know, about Seven Ages, but more importantly, it's to continue to fill that gap between the academic and the amateur collector. And we're trying to always get those two sides talking to each other. And on that note, we had some really in-depth discussions with some people there, and we learned a lot. But just want to take a moment to thank the organizers of this show. The Etowah Valley Artifact Show was put on by Todd Tibbetts and Lee Forsyth. The venue they've selected is a beautiful building. It's very large. It's modern. It's got everything that you need. Sometimes these shows, they tend to just be in smaller areas, maybe out of the way places, but this is a beautiful area, beautiful building, and a very highly professional show. We're looking forward to trying to get back out there next year to take part and get back out to see Etowah yet again. I'm sure there's some things that we missed, but again, these two fellows put on a fantastic show. We were even able to meet some of our listeners. Brooks Harris came by and talked to us, and he didn't actually know we were going to be there, and we obviously didn't know he was going to be there. So when he saw the Seven Ages logo, he was like, oh, wow, I listened to your show. And so it was really great to actually meet a fan and someone who's interested in what we do. And so he just wanted to say hi to Brooks and thank him for coming out and spending a few minutes chatting with us. James, what did you think about the whole affair?
Oh, I thought it was great, and I just want to echo what you said about the organizers. Those guys were great guys. They were very gracious hosts, and they were glad to have us there, and we were glad to be there. It was very neat meeting somebody that recognized the show. They were like, "Hey, I know the show." I was like, "Wow, that's the first time I think I've ever been recognized as a public figure, or as a you know what I'm saying." But yeah, and folks, if you've never been to Etowah, it's in Cartersville, Georgia, or near Cartersville, which is just northwest of Atlanta off I-75. And it's a nice little town. There, the convention center where we were at was like you said, it was a really nice venue. Had a great time. I just wish it was a little closer to Savannah. I think it was about a four and a half hour haul to get back.
Yeah. Listen to him complaining. 11 and a half hours to Connecticut, young man.
Yeah. If anybody's, from Atlanta, really loves Atlanta, hey, more power to you. But I'll be I'll be dead honest with you, and I tell people this all the time. I've driven in Atlanta and I've driven in Baghdad, and I'd rather drive in Baghdad.
I second that. And here's something else that we discovered at Etowah. Just the day before the summer solstice that we were there, we just missed Randall Carlson, who posted a picture standing on top of the mound. So
are you kidding?
24 hours.
Yeah. Randall lives in Atlanta, right?
Yeah, he's right down in that area. I had no idea he was going to be there. So you guys missed him by a day. Isn't that funny, though? Yeah, because, Chris McCollum and I, he, of course, being fairly esoteric-minded, we were trying to find a good place. We were, going around Connecticut. Keep in mind, we're planning for his wedding the following day, so our time was limited. But we were trying to find an obelisk or something funny that we could take a picture of in acknowledgement of the solstice. Yeah, so I'm not surprised that Randall Carlson would be down there. For those who aren't familiar with him, Randall Carlson is an independent researcher with a heavy emphasis on not just things like sacred geometry and the sort of lattice of geometry and architecture, et cetera, that was utilized by the ancients, but also geology. And I've attended a couple of lectures with him. Jason, you attended one of those with me, where he delves deeply into geology. A lot of his research kind of overlaps with some of ours, especially as it pertains to the Younger Dryas. And he's just a wonderful person, a fascinating guy. And there's probably hardly a subject as it relates to this sort of stuff, history, anything ranging from history, geology, and archaeology to some of the more arcane elements of history that we haven't discussed. And just a wonderful guy. So I'm really looking forward to you two being able to meet him at some point. On the subject of meeting listeners, by the way, I don't know that we have any definite plans right now for future events, although I know that there will be some because, as you guys hear often on the program, Seven Ages likes to go to events. Some of these events are lithic shows and things like this. Some of these events are lectures and public presentations. We have had in the works for quite a while the idea of doing something along those lines of our own. But if we are talking about going someplace on the show and you happen to hear us mention it and it's someplace near you and you're considering coming out, drop us an email. You can email us micah@sevenages.org. That's just 7, write out the number, SEVEN, ages, AGES.org. So it's Micah@sevenages.org, Jason@sevenages.org, or James@sevenages.org. Drop one of us an email and let us know. We'd love to meet some of our listeners from time to time, especially if you have interest in these kind of things, and we can link up and share some thoughts and ideas, observations about the past. That's what we love to do, and that's really why we go to these events. And keep in mind, of course, when we're on site, I saw you guys had the remote rig set up, and so we're often recording on location and everything. And if you enjoy the podcast, it's a great way to see us in action coming out to these events.
And of course, you can always find us on social media. We have Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. We keep those social media outlets updated with pictures and videos of different things that we're doing, articles when they come out on the website. And of course, it's really important for you, if you enjoy what we're doing, if you enjoy the content and the interviews and all the hard work that we put into the podcast, please just take a few minutes to rate and review Apple Podcast and various other podcatchers. Those ratings really help push the show up into the higher rankings so that we can get more listeners and we can grow the crowd and we can continue to do what we do out there on the road.
Absolutely, yeah. So be sure and interact with us. We are eager to hear from you, and I'm sure that you guys are probably eager to hear about our guests this week. We're going to be joined when we return here by a couple of, I'm very proud to say, friends of the program, Dr. Albert Goodyear and also Dr. Chris Moore. These are two of probably the finest archaeologists anywhere, but these guys happen to both reside in the Southeast, and so we've accompanied them on some dig sites. Al Goodyear, as you're going to hear, was kind enough to accompany Jason and James and I at one of the most, I think, enigmatic but also controversial early human sites located anywhere in the Southeast. There is quite a history. I mean, we're talking, according to some estimates, going back 50,000 years, possibly more. As far as the history related to this site, it is, of course, the famous Topper site in Allendale County. And boy, was heading out there in the company of these gentlemen truly an adventure. You're going to hear all about that and much more when we return. It is the 7 Ages Audio Journal. no secret to listeners of the Seven Ages Audio Journal that James and Jason and I are very passionate about Southeastern archaeology. No mystery there. Hey, we all happen to reside in the Southeast, and so do our guests today, who are going to be able to, I think, elucidate a lot of information and a lot of the intricacies as it relates to what can be learned about the past here in the Southeast. Now, joining us tonight are Dr. Christopher R. Moore. He's a geoarchaeologist with the Savannah River Archaeological Research Program. His research interests include site formation processes and geochronology of stratified sites in the southeastern coastal plain, as well as paleoenvironmental reconstruction, early hunter-gatherer adaptations, lithic technology, and immunological blood residue analysis. We're also joined by Dr. Albert Goodyear. He's an affiliate of the South Carolina Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology, University of South Carolina, and the director of the Southeastern Paleo-American Survey. Now, he's retired after 40 years of service, but remains on hand to continue Paleo-American studies, much to our benefit, by the way. And he's spent the last 30 years studying Paleo-Indian sites in South Carolina and adjacent sites, and has excavated chert quarry sites in the central Savannah River Valley. He's published extensively on Dalton, Clovis, and Redstone assemblages, and starting in 1998, he began studying Pre-Clovis and Clovis occupations at the Topper site in Allendale County, South Carolina. He's also worked with the Younger Dryas impact team, publishing evidence of a possible extraterrestrial impact that may have occurred 12,800 years ago. And he's also co-editor with our other guest, Dr. Christopher Moore, of the book Early Human Life in the Southeastern Coastal Plain, recently published by the University Press of Florida. Gentlemen, welcome. And Dr. Moore, I know last time we saw you, we were deep in a hole in the ground.
Right. Working up at the White Pond site near Elgin, South Carolina.
And the weather was nowhere near as nice as it is right now. Al Goodyear, you were there with us too, so I know you can attest to that chilly wind whipping around, which is kind of uncharacteristic for Columbia.
Very Pleistocene like.
Yeah, it almost kind of helped us get into the setting of what it might have been like had we been there 12,000 or so years ago. So anyway, it's wonderful to see both of you, and in slightly more accommodating circumstances. And I guess we'll go ahead and lead off with some interview questions here. Jason, take it away there, sir.
Yeah, Dr. Goodyear, I know that you have a long, long history of working with avocationalists, amateurs, students as well. So let's begin with you. Give us a little bit of background on your work working with amateurs and avocationalists, and what it means to your projects that you've worked on over the years.
Well, I think you've said it pretty well, that as long as I've been doing archaeology, even starting out as something of a hobbyist myself in high school down in Florida, I have always had sort of a soft spot in my heart for people who are interested in artifacts or archaeology, but who do not have formal training in it. They have a lot of curiosity and a lot of passion, and there's a lot more of them than there are of us. And they find things, they see things, they make extensive collections sometimes. And in some ways, to do the kind of work that Chris and I are doing, where we're looking at very ancient, low population density, wide-ranging geographic populations who left artifacts over a multi-county area as part of their normal existence. About the only way you can really get comprehensive data on those systems is by working with interested collectors who are eager to learn more about what they found, but also a lot of them, like yourselves, get excited about helping us tell the story as well. My program at Topper for 15 years ran on a program where we had people sign up from all over America. They would sign up for at least a week at a time, and some of them would sign up for longer. They would make a donation to the university so we could get our budget, and they would help us excavate. And many of them got to be very accomplished excavators, knew how to run the records and do some of the transit work and so forth. And quite honestly, the work that we've done at Topper, which, as I say, went on for about 15 years, there's just no way we could have ever had the funds to pay the labor that was necessary to do all of that work. So in that sense, I suppose I systematized my relationship with the public, with avocationalists, by bringing them into our program. And they were simply indispensable to our success. So I know Chris has similar stories with some of the artifacts that he's borrowed from private collectors doing some of the specialized studies, such as the protein analysis of projectile points. But to me, I think we kind of need everybody to do this work. And I feel like sometimes my colleagues, especially in the academy, are rather sort of hemmed in by their particular research project. There's nothing wrong with that, but being focused on a single site, which you have to do to get real progress in understanding some of these things. But if you're working on a single site all the time, you don't necessarily need input, external evidence, from, in this case, the collecting public. And for the kind of work that again, Chris and I are doing, and our good colleague up in North Carolina, Randy Daniel, we rely a lot, especially in the Paleo-Indian studies, on private collections. I would say 95% of the fluted points that have been recorded in our state database here in South Carolina have been found by the public. So that's a pretty startling figure right there, which serves to indicate how necessary it is for certain of these archaeological studies that you have a lot of friends in the collecting community.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's for sure, Dr. Goodyear. And as we've done our research and we've bounced around the Southeast, talking to people all over the place, folks who said, oh, I volunteered at Topper one time, or I knew someone who was out there. Do you know Al Goodyear? And so, that reputation that you've built with the amateur and such a significant site as Topper, and the people who are just willing to volunteer and come out and give their time.
Pure research grant money is rather rare and hard to get in North America. We had a couple of National Geographic grants, which were rather small compared to the latter years of what we called in those days the Allendale Paleo-American expedition that people signed up for. But the participants were just wonderful. And we would find some charcoal or something, and we would just let it be known that we need a couple of radiocarbon dates. And one of those who'd signed up would, at the end of the week, would hand me a check, and all of a sudden we could get a radiocarbon date. So, I mean, they really bought into the significance of what we were finding at Topper, and they were right about that. But we literally couldn't have done it without them, and it provided a steady source of labor and funding where we could go there year after year, and that's how we got so much done there.
Yeah. A little later, Dr. Goodyear, I do want to talk to you more about Topper. Of course, we were very privileged to be able to go there with you. First, Dr. Moore, I want to come over to you because you already mentioned White Pond, which is a site that I think all of us here are very familiar with. So why don't we maybe kind of begin talking a bit about that, the relevance of this site to your work and in the broader spectrum of Paleo-Indian American studies?
Right. Well, the White Pond work was sort of again, Al sort of spearheaded that in terms of getting the connections. But that's something we've been wanting to get involved at for a long time because of the history of White Pond and the early paleoenvironmental research that was done there. It's sort of a classic paleontological pollen study for the Southeast. And so we wanted to get in there and actually not only get a core out of the lake to do some more paleoenvironmental work, but we wanted to go back in and do some archaeology around the lake, which prior to us doing that, there had been no work done. And with my work at the Savannah River program, I've been at the program about 10 years, and I've tried to integrate my research interest with the avocational archaeologists that are out there and bring them in, have them work with us closely, both in the field and in the lab, processing artifacts, excavating artifacts. And so that's been really integral to the research that I've done, and I really couldn't have done a lot without them because I'm not part of an academic institution per se. I'm not teaching, I'm not a professor. I don't have access to students per se, and so a lot of the work, the labor that I've been able to get has been from volunteers, much like Dr. Goodyear has done with the Topper Center. And of course, you guys came up and helped us out, it's sort of at this point it's sort of a long-term research project where we have a lot of varied interest in White Pond, and not in addition to the core work and the paleoenvironmental reconstruction that we're trying to hopefully publish the results of that later this summer or this fall. But the archaeological investigations there are really trying to link up hopefully the early prehistory of the occupation of White Pond with the paleoenvironmental data that we have from our core out of the lake.
Right.
So we're just getting started with it, but we already got tremendous amounts of data.
The White Pond has been an absolutely famous site in paleontological studies in the Southeast. It's because it's got a very long, well-preserved pollen record that's pretty well radiocarbon dated, and it goes back well before the last major ice age. So a kind of archaeology that Chris and I and Mark Brooks and others of our team that we do, it's critical that we have a reconstruction of the climate and the natural world of these ancient people, because it's just not like it is today. You know, for example, mammoth and mastodons were running around for thousands of years, and of course they're not today. So there are at least 3 now extinct forest types representing about 30,000+ years that are represented in the White Pond pollen data. And of course, Chris has been spearheading our work there, looking for the platinum spike. And Chris, you want to tell a little bit about the platinum work and how White Pond is so critical to that?
Right. You know, the paper we published last year in the scientific reports basically reported on the discovery of a widespread platinum anomaly across the entire continent of North America, from California all the way to South Carolina. We've got 11 sites with either well-dated Paleo-Indian Clovis occupation, or we've got archaeology artifacts basically giving us a relative chronology. We tested the sediments from those sites, and every one of them came back with a large platinum anomaly at the Younger Dryas onset about 12,800 years ago, which indicated, to us that, one, it's consistent with the work that was done from the Greenland ice core, I think in 2013, by a team from Harvard who went up, and they were interested in testing this whole idea of the Younger Dryas impact. And so they went in looking for iridium consistent with what was found with the dinosaur extinction event, and said, okay, we're going to test this idea, and we're going to look for iridium. Well, they didn't find iridium. They found elevated platinum. And their conclusion was this was unusual in some ways in terms of the types of what would be expected to be found, but still was consistent with the likely input of an extraterrestrial source, from a sub-kilometer size impactor.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the initial impetus for going, okay, well, if that platinum spike is visible as present in the ice core, very high resolution, interannual layers of ice that can precisely look at the ice core. They knew, and the one thing we learned from that, we knew exactly when it came in, because of the ice core's high resolution. It's the gold standard for paleoenvironmental work. We knew when it came in exactly, which was at the very beginning of the Younger Dryas period, the onset of the Younger Dryas climate, and when we plunged back into sort of a cooler, drier glacial climate condition. And we also knew that being in the ice, that it was atmospheric input. This was coming in as platinum-rich dust or materials. We can talk about that later with regard to the whole YD impact idea. But we knew it had to come in at the right time and via the atmosphere. So there's only a couple of mechanisms, that can really account for that. One is extraterrestrial input, either comet or fragmented comet or asteroid, or volcanism. And we think we have ruled out volcanism and tested a lot of volcanic samples, and we don't think that any of the platinum anomalies really can be accounted for from the volcanic samples that have any reasonable chance of contributing to the Greenland ice core. And so we found this big platinum anomaly all over North America in sedimentary sequences that were consistent with what was found in the ice cores.
Right.
The sedimentary sites we're looking at is very shallow, sandy sites. The chronologies are not always really good. And so the next step for us was to go to a lake setting like White Pond and get a core out of the lake with this very long, detailed paleoenvironmental record going back probably to 30,000 years.
just to further clarify, for some folks at home who may be familiar with the Platinum Anomaly paper, which was published in the journal Nature, the two gentlemen we're speaking with tonight, of course, are co-authors and who have been contributors to this ongoing study. And so that's precisely what we're talking about. And like you mentioned, Dr. Moore, a little later we'll get into some of the relevance to the impact hypothesis. James?
Dr. Moore, as far as White Pond goes, can you discuss the significance, the existence of that body of water and how it's unusual to have that kind of feature in the Southeast?
Well, I think from what I understand, it's really the only large natural lake that we have in South Carolina. It's about 26 hectares. It's fairly shallow, but in places it has upwards of 6 meters of deposited peat, organic peat, and mud, which have accumulated in the bottom of the lake based on some work from our other colleagues, looks like for the last 30,000 years. So you've got this incredible record. There's Carolina bays that have deposits that would be similar, but to have a large lake like this that's been open and available for that length of time, it's just an amazing.
The Carolina bays, unfortunately, they're very old. And there's plenty of human occupation on the edges of it, as Chris and Mark Brooks have shown. But they dried out a lot, so that ruined the pollen preservation. There's nothing to radiocarbon date. So they've been a real source of frustration to paleoclimatologists and quaternarists. But White Pond is absolutely something of a geological anomaly, wouldn't you say, Chris?
Yeah, in many ways it is. I mean, like I said, it's we know that historically it's dried out, but we can tell from the core that looking at the peat and the muds in the core that the periods of dry out must have not been that severe because we have a virtual continuous record. So the material hasn't been desiccated and dried up, during necessarily for any particularly long period of time. And so it's had at some level it's probably had held water most of the time that it's been there.
Yeah. Now, just to clarify again, you'd mentioned that with the Dr. Goodyear, you'd actually said that when the Carolina bays had dried up, it was actually not conducive to the preservation of the pollen, which the cores from White Pond actually showed, which again indicates that White Pond has been continuously aqueous. Here's a question I have for you, though, and I think you guys talked about this a bit while we were there at the dig site earlier this year. Why do we differentiate White Pond from one of the Carolina bays? What would be the difference, and why is White Pond not one of them? Dr. Moore, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, a lot of the people, the members of White Pond, have thought of it as a Carolina Bay for many years, but we don't really see it as a Carolina Bay. One, it doesn't have the really nice elliptical shape. It has been shaped by similar processes to Carolina bays in some ways, but it also is even though the water level there is fairly shallow, the deposits of White Pond indicate that it was actually at one time very deep. And most Carolina bays are not deep; they're shallow, and they've been shallow from the beginning. Many of them have been dated, even older than White Pond, 100,000 plus years old with oil cell dating. But they tend to be very shallow. They dry out frequently, or seasonally wet. And so the deposits that are there tend to get desiccated, dry out during periods of drought, fire. It probably some of the organic sediments probably get removed and scoured away. But I think the depth of White Pond probably was crucial, and you don't see that kind of depth in Carolina bays. Now you do. There are several Carolina bays in North Carolina that colleagues of mine have recently published on. They've got some very large Carolina bays up there that hold water and have fairly deep, extensive records for Carolina bays. And they actually have records there going back 50,000. And this was published fairly recently. I forget the journal, but they've got really incredible pollen records going back from those bays going back 50,000. So there are Carolina bays out there that can have very long and detailed records, but it's rare. We really say White Pond is more of an interdune depression. You have these very large Pleistocene, Ice Age sand dunes. They sort of blocked the drainages from several small creeks, and in doing so created this natural depression. That's our best guess at the moment for how White Pond was formed.
Yeah, when we were out there, we walked around on the other side of the lake and looked at some of the dune features that are still still around and still visible. And that was one of the things that I didn't realize about the Southeast, the Paleoclimate at the time of the Younger Dryas and before, back during the last glacial maximum, was how dry and arid that part of the world was. So I had sort of fallen into that mindset about the bays, that they may actually be impact features. But, you and I had a conversation about it when we were up there at Topper at the end of the day one day. And after you explained the paleoclimate to me and the prevailing winds and that type of thing, I was brought out of the impact camp and into the Aeolian, wind feature.
Well, I think a lot of us were. Yeah.
There's been a lot of work in geology that has shown that they date tens of thousands, I guess even hundreds of thousands of years. So they don't date to one time period like, would happen if it was an impact. And,
right.
It's pretty easy just looking at the impacts on the moon and then looking at a satellite view of the coastal plain of the Southeast to go, wow, are those extraterrestrial impacts? But they're really not, and they were formed over several thousand years through wind patterns, and right. So that's always been sort of a kind of a side trip we've had to go through because people were all excited about the Younger Dryas boundary ET impact, and we're pretty intrigued by it too. So it's been something that continues to crop up, but it's just not based on good science.
At Carolina Bay in Robeson County, North Carolina, we had multiple sand rims that we were able to date with optically stimulated luminescence that show basically the decreasing age as you get closer to the basin. And so you've got these basins in some cases that have actually migrated, yet maintained their shape and orientation based on prevailing wind. And so going back to sort of Ray Kazarowski's 1977 dissertation work, he actually was able to more or less replicate these things on a wind table and show how prevailing wind orients, creates the ellipses and orients these things perpendicular to prevailing wind. And in this case, at least in certain geomorphic settings, the actual basins actually can migrate short distances. And in doing so, they create what we call a regressive sequence of sand rims that kind of track that migration pattern. And we really empirically demonstrated that with not only with the OSL dating, but the ground. We did geophysics, and we're able to see structures within the sand rim. It shows how these sand rims are actually built up by, wind and shore face, lake processes, rather than some kind of extraterrestrial impact or a crater type of thing.
Well, the Carolina Bays, though, themselves are very interesting and a significant landform on the Pleistocene landscape, because we know that prior to about 15 or 16,000 years ago, because of drier climate, and there were predominant winds that blew to the northeast, that you had these sand dunes accumulating on the east banks of your major rivers like the Altamaha and the Savannah. So there is a lot of wind activity going on, which is symptomatic of the whole last ice age. Which was drier and cooler, less vegetation, but we know that by Clovis times, 13,000 years ago, that people were occupying the edges of them. So that almost had to mean there was water standing during Paleo-Indian times, and also the rims are full of archaic artifacts, and so it's not reasonable to think that those would be there, except for the fact there's prehistoric Native Americans who are getting subsistence resources out of those bays, which means they almost had to have been, at least, if not full of water, damp.
Yeah. Again, the importance of that to stress really quickly. Jason, I know you got another question, but for folks who have argued that the bays might have been formations that were produced by ejecta from the, again, presumed impact that might have occurred around the time of the Younger Dryas, if Clovis lithics and evidence of occupation prior to the Younger Dryas is evident around those rims, it meant that the bays were there prior to the Dryas itself, because people were living and habitating along those shorelines at that time as well.
That's right. Clovis points and other Paleo-Indian tools shallowly buried in this situation of only about 50 centimeters in the sand rim. And there's another 2 meters of sand rim underneath that. So clearly the bays and the sand rims were there far longer than 12,800 years ago.
Well, Chris and I took you to the Johns Bay, Carolina Bay.
Mm-hmm.
That time this year we visited Topper, and the rim, the height of that rim is very impressive. It seemed like it was a couple of meters high. So you're talking about some serious accumulation of sands, on the shore face of these basically ponds. It's no wonder that people would climb up on these rims. They're high and dry, well drained, and then simply go out and do whatever activities they're doing to get plants and animals out of the Carolina Bay. So the point of it is, I think they've been a great source of attraction to prehistoric people for thousands of years. So they're not a insignificant piece of geography for subsistence studies.
I just want to take a second here for listeners. And if you go back to episode 9 of 7 Ages Audio Journal, we did an episode that is introductory to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. So, again, if this is new to you, please go back and reference that, and that'll give you a good basis for the conversation that we're having. And if you're not familiar with the Carolina Bay, just type that into a Google search and look for LiDAR images and other things like that. You can find some fantastic images of these overlapping elliptical shapes all up and down the eastern seaboard of, mostly South Carolina, North Carolina, but all the way up to, what's the furthest extent, Dr. Moore? We see them all the way up into New England, right?
Right, yeah, sure. They have very similar features all the way up there, and certainly all the way down into northern Florida.
Within the impact community, there are two very distinct sides. There's one side that believes that these Carolina bays are the creation of ice ejecta and other type of ejecta that came out of a comet strike into the Laurentide ice sheet, thus creating these elliptical shapes. And then Dr. Moore and Dr. Goodyear, your research seems to show that these are more natural, lacustrine and aeolian created features that have been occupied by both paleo and archaic people. So that's kind of where this conversation's coming from, if some of this is not familiar to you.
Again, the OSL dating of them, and even some radiocarbon dating, shows they don't have a single period of formation. They were formed over thousands and thousands of years, which is inconsistent with a extraterrestrial impact.
And as important as the White Pond site is to this discussion, and we've already touched on some of those things that you're finding and discovering there at the White Pond, Dr. Goodyear, could you talk about the evidence for impact that occurs at the Topper site, and how was that first discovered, and what does it mean to this whole conversation?
Topper, as it turns out, has gotten me into a lot of things. Some things that I wasn't sure I really believed in, but that's why you go to the field and do science, and you continue to learn. But in 2005, a fellow named Alan West, whose name is all these journal articles are replete with Alan's name. He's a brilliant synthesizer in science. He called me up and said, "Hello, I'm Alan West," or something, and I'm working with a extraterrestrial impact team, and we're looking to go to Clovis sites because we think the impact happened at the Clovis period, and we know, you can go on the internet and you can see that Topper had at that point a pretty spectacular Clovis occupation. And he said we'd like to come and gather some sediments from the Clovis layer, if you'd be so kind as to point it out where it was, because we want to do this ET study. I'm thinking, wow, ET, really? I'm into an impossibly old, according to some people, impossibly old pre-Clovis site at Topper. Our dates of 50,000 had come back on the lower unit, and they could be older than that. And I'm thinking to myself, do I really do I really need to? This sounds like a Bruce Willis movie out of Hollywood or something, you know. So anyway, one of the best decisions I ever made was to tell Alan West, sure, I don't know what you're doing exactly, but please come and I'll show you where the Clovis layer is in the profile. And he hadn't been there 30 minutes. He was grinning. He had this plastic bag with a magnet. He had these magnetic spherules, you know, clustering up on it. And I'm thinking, well, I guess if he's happy, I'm happy. If I still don't know what he's doing. But anyway, there have been 4 different studies now over the years on evidence for ET impact at Topper. And 3 out of the 4 have shown that's exactly what is associated with the Clovis level there. And the one study that didn't find it, actually they did not they didn't follow the proper extraction direction. So the other 3 teams also found it. So Topper was my introduction to all of this, and it has been absolutely thrilling to work with some of these really great scientists from all over the U.S. and from Europe as well. And the first publication on the YD boundary impact hypothesis was 2007 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. And Topper was included there, and so was I as a co-author. With the publication by Chris. Chris is the lead on our platinum anomaly that came out last year, 2017. That is 10 straight years of publication in very highly visible, high impact scientific journals, peer-reviewed journals. So the story is not going away, and the platinum study that Chris led the team on last year is yet another elemental marker to show that there's something really going on, you know, right at about 12,800 years ago. So that was like I always try to give Alan West some credit here. Having him come and introduce me to all this is just, to me, one of the best things that ever happened to Topper and also to my research.
Well, with the accumulation of all this data, though, again, we have to kind of point out the white elephant in the room. This impact theory is often met with derision, and there's a lot of controversy that is stirred up. Why is that? Well,
I'm sure Chris can give you his opinion on that, but I guess the thing about there's sort of a public view, a layperson's view, and even sometimes with archaeologists that, you know, science tends to be a collection of facts. So if everybody agrees on the facts, then they're going to always agree on the conclusion. You know, and most of the time, or eventually, you know, that's how it works out. But there can be a lot of bumps and dips in the road on the way, and the idea that this thing could be a result, the Younger Dryas onset, could be the result, you know, both in the northern hemisphere of Canada and Europe, as something as catastrophic and bizarre as an extraterrestrial impact. I mean, right away, that's a pretty bold claim, although the Earth history is full of meteor strikes and comets, and it's not as though that ever happened. But the thing about it was people don't like new things that are seemingly dramatic or difficult to believe, and you have to keep, you know, publishing and doing new studies with different teams, whether that's new protocols for cancer treatment or in physics or astronomy, whatever it is. These things have to be, these findings, you know, with the methodologies have to be replicated from team to team or hospital to hospital until it's finally admitted as valid, settled science or knowledge in science. So, in that sense, no one's really picking on the Clovis Comet team, although it does some of the criticisms seem well, shall we say, a little besides the point. So, but it is a dramatic thing, and I think there's also a resistance to catastrophism. In other words, wanting to always have the dramatic, spectacular. Well, a meteorite came in and destroyed the Egyptians, or whatever, wiped out this civilization. A tsunami came, and I think in nature and even in culture, life kind of goes along in a slow, boring fashion. There are wars, there are tsunamis, we know that, but the idea of appealing to a catastrophic event, I think, especially in the scientific community, which tends to be slow and skeptical, and they're supposed to be.
Sure.
That's too much drama, too much History Channel, too much Bruce Willis, Hollywood, and so forth.
Well, the catastrophism is appealing culturally, which is part of the reason for the aversion in the sciences. I see that. Dr. Moore, would you like to chime in?
Well, yeah, I mean, the initial criticism, and this continued since 2007. I mean, this was an extraordinary claim, and there were a lot of components that were thrown into the original 2007 Firestone et al. Paper, including, again, I haven't read the paper in quite some time, but there was at least if not an explicit, an implicit assumption that Carolina bays were related, even in that paper. And I think for a lot of people like myself and Mark Brooks and others who worked on bays, I think when we first were exposed to that, we said, well, that doesn't make sense. So we were immediately skeptical about everything else, right?
Yeah.
And so many things were thrown in, right? The idea that the impact triggered the Younger Dryas climate event may have had something to do with the megafauna extinction, that it might have had something to do with the demise or decline of early Clovis Paleo-Indians. So there was a lot of things thrown in. There were researchers, in parts of the country who took exception to some of that and said, well, we don't see any evidence of a decline, post-Clovis. I think Dr. Goodyear and others, certainly have seen at least some evidence of that in terms of the numbers of Clovis versus redstone points in the southeast. There certainly is a decline that seems to occur in the numbers of points immediately after Clovis. So there's some evidence there that there might have been either a population decline or some kind of demographic shift in population at that same time. But there are so many elements to this idea that's been sort of lumped together and thrown together. And inevitably, and I think Alan West and others would tell you, they would readily admit this, many or some of these ideas probably won't pan out. Everything that has been thrown in and speculated about it, probably is not going to pan out, or, but we're going to learn through this process. I think the one thing that's happened in the last couple of years, there's been such a flurry of papers coming out in support of some type of extraterrestrial impact that some of the criticism, I think, is some of the main critics sort of appear to be giving in. I know a few years ago, the paper that came out, Surovell et al. Came out and said he couldn't replicate the microspiral evidence, including at Topper, if I'm not mistaken. And then it was showed later, Malcolm McComb and others came in and said, well, you didn't do the protocol. You didn't follow the protocol for extraction or the magnetic grains in order to find these microspirals, which if you don't do it correctly, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack.
Chris, real quick, have there been people who have been critical of the theory that will reference a paper, like you mentioned, which has not followed the correct protocols, but nonetheless use that as evidence to the contrary of the impact argument?
The Surovell paper was referenced extensively, and probably continues to be by some of the critics of the impact. Although, I think there were a lot of people at the time, and I forget the year the Surovell paper came out, when he said he couldn't replicate the results, but there were a lot of archaeologists and geoscientists who were sort of open-minded. They thought, well, I'm not sure about this idea. I'm really skeptical. And when they saw that paper, they said, aha, see, I knew something was wrong. It's, the hypothesis is incorrect. And so it really had at least a short-term, a very profound effect on people's views. But since that time, and there's been a few other critical papers, but there's been such a flurry of other papers in major journals that have come out with other evidence. It's almost overwhelming at this point. And certainly the platinum paper that I was the lead on, along with Dr. Goodyear and others, And I have a feeling, just from the limited interactions with people, that's really made people look at it again a little more closely, though, including some of the skeptics. They're either sort of coming around and saying, okay, well, maybe something did happen. They may say, well, we disagree with some of the other ideas about Clovis, being wiped out, or megafauna extinction or something like that. But maybe we're, some of the critics are starting to change their mind a little bit. We hope they are, because we think clearly the evidence is supporting the idea that there was some type of extraterrestrial impact.
Sure.
I was just going to repeat again what I'd said before about your question: why are these things so instinctively rejected, so out of hand? And it is a big claim. I think to claim that something came in and was the original cause of the Younger Dryas event, which is a very freakish, strange thing to have happened so many thousands of years after the glaciers had melted. One of our authors, who's in the National Academy of Sciences, James Kennett, has basically devoted his career, I think he was in marine science, marine geology, he's devoted his career to explaining the Younger Dryas, because most of the big megafauna went away about that time. We know the Clovis people did. So all those very mysterious phenomena had already been identified, and to have someone come along and say, well, we think some sort of a comet type impact came in, and that's the trigger for it, is really in light of what had been talked about and written about, that was a pretty dramatic claim. But getting back to what I'd said before, this is what's supposed to go on in science, and sometimes it goes on for decades. I don't know how long the Alvarez's meteorite impact that knocked out the dinosaurs, I don't know how long. I think that was published in Science, and I don't know how many decades before that got universal acceptance either. So, but that's the way it's supposed to work. It can be frustrating if you think you've really got, the good evidence and a hypothesis that really illuminates the past, and people are going, well, I don't know, I don't think so. It is frustrating, but you can't give up if you believe in what you've got, and other teams come along, even using different data sets. That's like the new cancer protocol. It works so well in one hospital. Well, it better work in every hospital that you apply the protocols, or no, it's probably not real. So, no one's picking on us in that sense. It's just, that's the way, science works.
It's a tale of two doctors, Dr. Chris Moore and Dr. Albert Goodyear, Southeastern archaeologists and co-authors of the book Early Human Life in the Southeastern Coastal Plain. We're talking a good bit about the impact up to this point. Jason, what do you think? Maybe we get into some lithic analysis, because we just happen to have two of the foremost experts on stone tools and the different varieties and the periods from which they emanate on the program with us right now.
It's one of my favorite topics, that's for sure. Just for the listeners, the book that we just described, Early Human Life on the Southeastern Coastal Plain, is currently available from the University of Florida Press, and it is edited by both of these gentlemen that is with us tonight. But Chris, you also have another book out that is available on Amazon called Prehistoric Chipped Stone Tools of South Carolina, with yourself and a legendary avocationalist for the state of South Carolina, Mr. Tommy Charles. So tell us a little bit more about that book.
Right. This book I can certainly tell you lots of stories about working with Tommy over the years. But Tommy worked for the Institute of Archaeology in Columbia for many years, and his job was to go around and to actually document private collections over the entire state of South Carolina. And over many years, he was able to go around virtually every county throughout the state and document tens of thousands of artifacts that were private collections. He, for example, for spear points and arrowheads, he would document the types, recognized types, the time periods, the raw material. And so this book, which Tommy had pulled together much of this in a draft form even before my involvement, but he wasn't sure for a long time that he was going to publish, and we really encouraged him to do that. And it's really the culmination of many years and just thousands and thousands of hours of Tommy and others going out and documenting collections over the entire state. And so this, we really are proud of this, that Tommy was able to, and I was able to help Tommy pull this book together for the Piedmont Archaeological Trust.
Yeah, and it's much more than a book. I mean, I have a copy of it right here on my desk, and it's a tool, it's a reference. I also have the poster here hanging in the studio, which I look at often, but it has a fantastic amount of references in it. All the charts that you guys put in the back with the lithic distribution and the point types and all of those type of things is extremely good for referencing the intricate details of the lithic. So, and
those are the GIS computer maps showing the distributions of chert and quartz. There's no way professional archaeologists have that data. It's the cumulative result of people collecting all over the state, and then somebody like Tommy Charles coming along and spent several years interviewing him and recording him. And what we have are these fantastic maps now that I would say it's about 99% collector data, isn't it, Chris?
Oh, yeah, almost entirely. I culled the database down from probably almost 300,000 of all kinds that Tommy documented down to roughly 90,000 arrowheads and spear points, for the entire state. And, it's taking that data into a GIS computer software, I was able to produce distribution maps and look at really robust patterns of spatial distributions of raw material types, of various types of spear points, different time periods. And so I was creating these things, and as I was doing it on the computer, this data and these spatial patterns were popping up, and it was like, opening a present every time this was the first time anybody was really seeing this being produced by the computer that was showing us large scale patterns, both, over time and space. And you could see how the distributions of raw material, use of coastal plain chert, metavolcanics, quartz, orthochartite. You can see that the changing distributions through time over many millennia. You can see some of the major well-known projectile point types, how their distributions change through time. And so this is really illuminating, and it's something that simply couldn't have been done without using avocational collector data. That wants to argue that, well, we shouldn't be working with collectors, or we shouldn't be dealing with people who collect. Well, you really have to step back and think, for a lot of the things that many of us are interested in, particularly the lithic technology and the Archaic period, the Paleoenvian period, we simply wouldn't know really hardly anything about the distribution over the state without looking at that data. Yeah. So it's extremely important, to do that.
Yeah, it's a whole other view of free history that would only be faintly seen using institute collections or museum collections, just because you don't have the coverage. People have been finding artifacts, for probably over a century in every county in South Carolina. So that data was just there, and Tommy was just a real wonderful statesman, a real ambassador for archaeology for this state, and they loved cooperating with him, and so he was sort of the human key that unlocked all this. And so the data were there, and then when Chris came along, he's a whiz with a computer mapping, especially GIS. So, voila, when that all happened, you see these fantastic maps in the back of their book, and you can see that a lot of the rhyolite in South Carolina, obviously coming out of the Uwharrie Mountain area, for example, from North Carolina.
Right.
I mean, it is obvious. And it's quantitative. It's based on multiple samples, and you can go to the bank with some of those maps.
Absolutely. Well, I heard anecdotally recently a geologist refer to the fact that, a lot of archaeologists actually have a background in art, and many of them aren't actually doing science. So I want to dispel that right now with this conversation. It's quite evident that there's a lot of practical applications for science, computer technology, statistics, etc., that goes into archaeology, not just in the Southeast, all around the world. And this is just fascinating to hear about this. Chris, something we've talked a lot about with you over the years has to do with protein residue analysis, which is kind of in your purview. And you found some very interesting things on the East Coast. Can we talk about what protein residue analysis is and what it has led to in terms of what Paleo-Indian hunters were actually killing?
The method is a forensic technique that's been used for probably over 50 years, so it's a very well-established technique. And it's called crossover immunoelectrophoresis, which is very difficult to say if you don't do it very slowly. But the method is you take the artifacts, and they extract residues out of these tools. They're not blood stains on the outside of the artifacts, but we think they're blood residues that have been absorbed into microfractures that are created in the stone tool during manufacture. And there's been experimental replication to show this. And when you produce a stone tool through flint knapping and flaking of the tool, it produces microfractures. When those tools are used, the blood is absorbed into those tiny microfractures through capillary uptake. And they probably get sealed in by clay sediments, fill in the cracks. And that probably is the most likely explanation for how some of these blood residues are able to be preserved for in some cases, up to 13,000 years. And in other parts of the world, they've found residues on stone tools going back much further. So, yeah, we did that for, looking at artifacts first from Flamingo Bay, which was a Carolina Bay on the Savannah River site, and looked at Paleo-Indian artifacts. And then we looked at a whole suite of projectile points from every time period, from the Archaic through the Woodland period, Mississippian period. We tested them, and we got some really interesting results, and results that we think are really consistent and make sense ecologically, environmentally.
The Clovis people are often thought of as big game hunters, mammoth hunters, and many argue that they almost exclusively hunted that type of prey. What are you seeing from their blood analysis, and does it seem to confirm or deny that pattern?
That's been one of the more interesting things that we've looked at. The initial study, we did look at some Clovis artifacts. We've since looked at a lot more Clovis artifacts from not only South Carolina and Georgia, but also a large collection in North Carolina. And probably on the order of 75 Clovis artifacts we've tested for blood residue. And we have yet to find any evidence of extinct Pleistocene megafauna, extinct animals of any sort on these Paleo-Indian tools. The one thing that we did find early on, and have continued to find, is evidence of bovid or bison blood residue. And that's something that we seem to see frequently, early and often with Paleo-Indian Clovis, Redstone, Dalton, and then we find some evidence of bison all the way up until the Middle Archaic period, so from like 13,000 to 7,500 years ago. We have some evidence of bison, and then we've yet to find any evidence after that. So the blood residue evidence we have for Paleo-Indian Clovis points in particular, we've yet to find any evidence of these, the mastodon or mammoth or some of these other large Pleistocene animals, but we are seeing clear evidence that they were targeting and exploiting, probably herds of bison, be it Bison antiquus, which was a much larger subspecies of bison, or bison. We don't know. We can't distinguish that with the method we're using. But clearly they were targeting bison. I think people need to really maybe step back and reevaluate some of the stereotypes. I'm not saying that they didn't knock down some of these large. We've got wild turkey. We've got all kinds of other animals on these tools, including bison.
So opportunistic with a preference for bison burgers.
Yes.
Well, hey, Chris, so you got to tell them about the Dalton Point results from White Pond.
Ah, yes, please.
Right. The Dalton, we got a Orfield quartzite, which is sort of a cemented sandstone Dalton point we found in situ at White Pond last spring, deeply buried for a coastal plain site about a meter down. And we collected that. We were able to pick it up without touching it, which as a protocol, we try to do that now with anything we find. We don't want to handle it. We don't want to wash it. We want to sort of minimize any potential for contamination. If I ate a hamburger and handled an artifact, well, that's going to potentially add something that's going to give you a positive result for something. So we don't want to do that. So we collected the Dalton point without touching it or washing it. We send it for blood residue analysis, and it's our first artifact to come back with positive for human blood residue.
Human blood residue.
Human blood residue.
Okay, now if we're to interpret that really quickly, guys, what exactly does this mean?
Well, that's a good question. Dr. Robert Gilhay up at California State University is doing the blood residue for me, and we talked about the results, and of course, you can speculate. Well, was this a murder weapon? Was just used on somebody? It's also likely for many people who have experience, flint knapping, producing stone tools. It's common to cut yourself, to nick your finger. Just the handling of the artifact itself, even by prehistoric people, may have contributed some of the residues that led to this positive human blood residue that we got for that artifact.
Well, they say every stone tells a story, but this takes that to an all new level, doesn't it?
Yeah. I mean, this was a real shocker.
Yeah, it's amazing that this protein or blood residue is able to withstand the ravages of time.
Right. I mean, that's one of the major, I guess, some of the critics of this method have sort of, come out and say, well, how can it be? How can you have protein residues, which the technical term, which I'd have to ask some of the immunologists about this. There's a term called linear epitopes, just some sort of derivative, some sort of residue of the protein itself. I'm not sure that DNA is even preserved in these cases, but there's something left over from the protein that, again, I think has to be getting into these microfractures. I think that's really the only explanation, that they're being preserved. These aren't blood stains on the outside of the tool. There's some sort of residual protein residue that's being basically brought into these tiny fractures in the stone and then protected and preserved.
Right, because even though this material looks like it's smooth and it doesn't have any holes or anything in it, it still does have some porosity to it and a little, like you said, microfractures. And I guess they're not really doing a DNA test, but they're somehow typing this to certain types of animals.
Yeah, for this test, they use modern antibodies, modern antisera from animals we have today. So, for example, to test for the presence of extinct megafauna such as a mammoth or mastodon, they use, I think, the modern African elephant antibodies or antisera to test for that. And so you get a positive reaction or a negative reaction based on this method. But you can't distinguish. You can't say, well, this is a mastodon or this is a mammoth or this is some other proboscidean type species. All you can say is that you've got a positive or negative reaction.
Right. That's still very interesting, though.
Well, and also, I mean, the fact that if you are able to determine that there is something similar to the modern African elephant, therefore it is in likelihood a mastodon, and therefore you have detected megafaunal, residue, which is, again, evidence that this protein, like you said, James, does last the test of time. So, those who are critical of it, I mean, it's quite evidential that we have specific animal types that can be attributed directly, and which, of course, were hunted in this way.
And we have virtually no bones of bison. The BOS signature is considered to be a bison in prehistory. But ever since I've been doing Southeastern Archaeology, the fact that you don't see any bison bones in the Indian Middens, yet during the Pleistocene we know there were bison here, an extinct form in the modern woodland bison. And so the idea was the bison after the end of the Ice Age just left when it went extinct or were extirpated to the plains, which but you can hardly deny the blood residue signal. And there's been finally a bison bone dated from the Atlantic off Georgia that's about 6,000 radiocarbon years. So there's probably a big preservation problem that's plaguing our finding even mammoth and mastodon bones. So, we're not saying they didn't kill, the Proboscideans.
Sure.
But we can't say they did. But there's lots of other what you would call modern fauna, raccoon, squirrel, rabbit, bobcat. There's a lot of that on even the Paleo-Indian pieces. So, but they probably were killing more of those and getting the meat and the skins than they were trying to, bring down a 5,000-pound pachyderm, which would have been a very dangerous group effort. We're not saying they didn't. We're just saying we don't have any evidence that they did.
Over the course of the conversation, we've talked an awful lot about Paleo-Indian environments. As we're getting kind of into the home stretch here because we don't want to keep everybody all night, maybe we should talk just a bit about Pre-Clovis archaeology in the Southeast. Dr. Goodyear, I know that this is kind of particularly in your purview because you go, some would say perhaps into pre-Clovis at sites like Topper.
Yeah. Right.
Again, what's the big takeaway there?
Well, that's talking about sort of an overused term, but you talk about paradigm changes, whether it's in medicine or law or whatever the field, in this case archaeology. There really are such things, and they're based on discoveries, I guess almost like black swans that somebody as a field didn't really think that was possible. But people did, and I wasn't a wild-eyed, there's got to be people here before Clovis type of archaeologist. I was kind of frustrated and skeptical with the whole thing. But in the last 20 years, there just have been some amazingly good archaeological and scientific studies, whether in South America, in Mexico or in North America and in Alaska, that shows that there clearly were people here back 17,000, 18,000 years ago in what I call the late glacial period. And, a lot of the genome modeling and so forth shows that those people were coming from somewhere over, in central Russia. So the science is coming together pretty well on that. Not every site that's claimed to be Pre-Clovis is accepted. I have to say that. And you do have to do a lot of very careful science. For one thing, there are not that many sites because there probably weren't that many people there. The number of Pre-Clovis sites compared to Clovis sites is just huge. Clovis is spoken of now as the first settlement culture in North America, whereas the Pre-Clovis peoples would be referred to as colonizers. So I think for now, given the huge difference between the rarity of Pre-Clovis sites and the almost common existence of Clovis sites, that makes a lot of sense. So I think most people who are actively in the field doing research, they may not accept every Pre-Clovis site, but I think so many of them now from Monteverde down in Chile to even Alaska now has sites that date 16, 17,000. I think there's enough of them now that most reasonable people agree that there was a human presence here, at least by the time of the last glacial maximum or just thereafter. When you go back before what's called the last glacial maximum, which is about 18, 19,000 years ago to maybe 22 or 23,000 years ago, that is the time when both the South and the North Pole were covered with glaciers. The Earth went into a severe ice age, and of course it sucked up a lot of the water in the oceans around the world, and that lowered sea level. And there's probably lots of sites that are out on the seabed now because of that. But it was a huge climatic event that lasted a few thousand years. So, question is there anybody here before LGM, last glacial maximum? And Topper, in my view, and I go to take some effort in the book to report some other radiocarbon dates from the stream bed of Topper, but you can read it for yourself. But I would say Topper is minimally 25,000 years old. In the upper layer, and the upper layer maybe is as old as 35,000. And then in the lower level, which we call the Pleistocene Terrace, the radiocarbon dates there are dead. In other words, the signal's gone. The artifacts that are found there are the same artifacts that are found in the upper zone. So, at least from my work, I'm convinced that people were here well before the last glacial maximum. And there's a place in Oklahoma called Burnham, which has 30,000-year-old radiocarbon dates on stone tools associated with the bison there. And there's one called Monteverde 1, I believe it is, right close by to Monteverde 2 in Chile, and they've got a couple 33,000-year-old dates with stone tools. So there's more and more work being done in South America showing that sites there date from 25,000 back to nearly 40. So it's sort of a work in progress, but I think as people are looking where they weren't looking before, you don't find what you don't look for. It's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. But in South America, they're going into the caves and shelters that they think may have some great depositional depth, and they're very carefully digging down into that and getting stone tools and old dates. So Pre-Clovis is in process. How does that sound?
Hey, it's a thing.
And it's good. There's enough evidence now that it's a legitimate thing to be doing. And the question is, what about the Southeast? And in our book, Chris and I talk about the fact that there was no ice age in the South. There were no glaciers in the South. They were in the Midwest and in the Northeast. So and in many of the faunas that are down here were northern species that came down into the lower Southeast and coexisted with really what were more subtropical kinds of animals, like you'd see in Cuba and Florida and Georgia and so forth. So it was a very, very strange kind of mix of plants and animals from northern latitudes and southern latitudes, meaning that there was an optimal climate here with not having harsh winters. So things were optimum climatically, and people who would have come in here from wherever. They could have come up from South America through the Caribbean. They could have come over from, the land bridge. We don't know, and there's a plausible hypothesis by the Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian and Bruce Bradley about Salutrian-looking artifacts, in the Chesapeake Bay area. So I don't want to forget about that. Right. A lot of stuff is up in the air right now, and I think in the expression I use, the light is now green in the Western Hemisphere for searching for pre-Clovis sites, and they are what they are. If they have stone tools or cut animal bone and they date 30, 40, 50, 60,000, that's probably what they are. And again, it's because so many people now feel like it's a legitimate and worthwhile thing to do.
And let me just interject really quickly, James. I know you got another question too, but maybe Dr. Moore will get your opinion on this, because Al, in the past, you've, and I'll always remember this, riding around all day with you in a car and heading out to Topper and visiting one of the Carolina bays. It was a real day of adventure, you and Jason and I together in one vehicle, and James trailing not too far behind. And something you brought up that day was the idea of failed migrations. There seems to be a debate right now between genetic science, which says unequivocally, we know that these people came from East Asia, but then there's the archaeological evidence. And I think part of the problem, I'll just say this really quickly, is that we recognize Clovis as the earliest single identifiable widespread cultural manifestation. That doesn't mean that there isn't lithic evidence, stone tools from much earlier, but that they aren't directly attributable to other cultures. Now, what's interesting is that on the Northeast coast, you mentioned that Salutrian hypothesis, the lithics that have been found on the Northeast coast do bear resemblance to those produced by the Salutrian culture in Europe.
A strong resemblance. Strong resemblance.
Right.
So, the failed migrations, there is an offset there, a disconnect between the genetic studies and archaeology. Although I think they're saying that they think, based on the genetic dating, that people got here about 30,000 years ago. But if people came and went extinct, they had no genetic footprint. So the idea that, well, we got it all figured out because the genetic people have done this a great service, and people start finding sites like Topper that date 40, 50, 60,000, there's something wrong here. And I think at some point, what we would hope for in science is a harmonization of genetic, archaeological, maybe even linguistic data. In other words, they would all be saying the same thing eventually. And right now, they aren't particularly doing that.
Right.
So what I think archaeologists need to do is keep on digging, and then and for me, and I think for many archaeologists, the trump card here is if you have genuine artifacts that are validly associated with the sediments that the stratigraphy you find them in. I mean, that's the very nature of what archaeology is. So in that sense, for me anyway, artifacts trump genes.
Right.
Chris, did you want to chime in there?
I mean, the genetic evidence certainly is amazing. It seems like there's something new coming out almost every week with some kind of new information. And certainly the genetic evidence, most of that supports at least a late Pre-Clovis. Whether or not it goes back, supports in kind of like 30, 40, 50,000-year-old Pre-Clovis. So certainly the evidence seems to suggest that there were populations already present in this hemisphere prior to the Clovis time period. And of course, you're getting, the evidence now that these people had to have gotten here before the ice-free corridor was open. The traditional view of the Clovis ancestors coming down the ice-free corridor, that doesn't seem to be holding water at this point, and so there's much more evidence now for seafaring populations, certainly at least coming along the specific, island hopping, coming down the west coast and spreading into the North and South America via that route. So, but the one thing I think to keep in mind, and I'm certainly a fan of the genetic work that's being done, is we still have very, very few data points. We have very few early skeletons, Paleo-Indian in particular, Clovis, that we have any genetic evidence from. Of course, the ones we do, certainly, I'm not sure that there's any clear evidence. People will argue over the so-called X haplotype. And certainly, Bradley and Stanford have done that with regard to a possible European connection, the Solutrean connection, people coming across the North Atlantic. But I think most geneticists certainly don't necessarily buy into that, at least at this point. And they see clear evidence that, people coming out of traditional, sort of land bridge and or coming along by boat,
Asia.
Out of Beringia, along the west coast. That kind of thing.
Yeah, one of the things I say a lot these days when people say, well, where do you think they came from? I say, well, I don't know. And I don't think that's the best question to be asking right now. I think the best question is, what are they doing here?
Right.
It's an amazing thing. The other thing is, and Chris just said it, there's so few data points, even in what I call the late glacial, pre-Clovis sites. We just need to keep our minds open and keep working on this, and not have a defeatist attitude or simply reject something like the Clovis comet. That's so way out there. It would take a lot, quote unquote, to convince me of that. Well, there's about 10 years of independent research now that's doing just that. So if you're not content to see it as a process, it isn't going to be the case isn't going to be one in one site or 1 year, but I think over the decades the truth will come out, and I'm convinced that we're just not even digging in the right places. And that's what happened at Topper. You go down today, you go, whether it's in Tennessee or Georgia or South Carolina, wherever you go to the modern day river, there's pottery there and there's arrowheads, and then you dig down and you hope you you find Clovis, which they rarely do, when in fact in the case of the Savannah River, it was not flowing where it is today elevationally until about 15,000 years ago. And in fact, it was flowing at higher elevations. And that's what we did. Better to be lucky than good. We blundered into the second terrace, the Pleistocene stream bed of the Savannah River, and that's where the Pre-Clovis artifacts were. And that's probably the last place anybody would ever dig for these things. So if surface water was at a shortage, which it no doubt was, even though you didn't have glaciers down here, maybe lakes and ponds were smaller and rare. They look like, to me, they would function as oases. And so that's what we're hoping we're gonna see at White Pond. That given the dryness of the landscape and the climate, almost no matter what period, except the last 10,000 years, with more modern rainfall, the hope is that as long as there was some water in White Pond, and as long as there were some number of human beings, in that part of South Carolina, they're going to end up coming to White Pond to get water or fish or whatever. So we need to look at the paleo landscapes where we have found pre-Clovis sites and even Clovis sites, and we need to go to school on those and say, okay, well, where would be more likely features? And the obvious one at Topper is chert. It's a chert quarry. Mm-hmm. So practically anybody who came up the Savannah River, if they kept going, they'd run into the chert outcrop. So, chert's like a magnet for humans. So I think we need to kind of put our thinking caps on and sort of, as I say, think outside of the box, like, well, where's the best place to be during LGM around here? Or where's the best place to be when things were wetter?
Dr. Goodyear is talking about the Topper site, the stuff that you found at the lower terrace. You mentioned that some of the artifacts there, the things you tested for radiocarbon there in that area were radiocarbon dead, which, correct me if I'm wrong, that means, and I don't want you to say anything that you don't have evidence for, but for something to be radiocarbon dead, it needs to be older than 50,000 years.
Right. So those are minimal ages.
Sure.
And every place we dated down to about 2 meters. They were all, 48, 49, 55. So I think the geologist concluded that the whole Pleistocene terrace is radiocarbon dead. What we need to do is get some OSL dates out of that and sort of ballpark it in. I don't think anybody thinks they're here during Sangamon. What would that be, 120, 130? Right. But, if the dates come back about 50,000, that would be sort of an independent confirmation of that's about how old it is.
Yeah. Guys, where, by the way, I know that you've got plenty going on at all times, and I just want to interject that on behalf of Jason and James and I, part of the way that we've been able to get to know you two is being avocationalists who volunteer. Are there places where people, if they want to become involved in archaeological fieldwork and who can lend, man hours and manpower, where they can find out about doing that in the Southeast?
I don't know of a single website. Do you, Chris? I mean, Chris uses them. I've used them. I think most active field research programs do like to incorporate volunteers where they can. Wouldn't you say, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably hard for a lot of people to find those when they're going on. Many excavations will certainly entertain the idea, at least, of bringing in avocationalists and volunteers. I certainly do. Anybody that's interested in possibly working with me, they can go to I have a Facebook project page, the White Pond Human Paleoecology Project. If you type that into Facebook, you'll find that project page, and you'll be able to see updates on the any future fieldwork that we have going on. I'm anticipating going back there in the spring of 2019. So, if anybody's interested, certainly we had a nice group of volunteers come this year, including you guys. We appreciate that. Of course, I've used volunteers the entire time I've been in South Carolina on the Savannah River site. But yeah, anything like that's going on, I try to get the word out on social media. Certainly other DNR, South Carolina Department of Natural Resources has done extensive volunteer types of excavations at the Kolb site on the Ph.D. over 20 years. That project is no longer going on, but there's other projects that happen all the time. With shell rings and shell mounds being worked on the coast of South Carolina. Again, it's not always easy for the lay public to find out about these, but certainly they are available and they're out there. Many of us appreciate the help.
I'm not doing active digs now. I'm trying to help out some with Chris, his field work. We have mutual research interests, but I am working a lot with the collecting public. And that's kind of where I'm most active, since I'm still trying to record, fluted points for the state of South Carolina, but also for the state of Florida and some in North Carolina. So I have contact more among, hobbyists, the collectors.
Yeah, and that's a big part of really what Seven Ages does. Again, that's really kind of how Jason Pintrail and I got to know each other, and then James came into the picture. Was we both had a love for the archaeology and for the actual lithic tools, not just collecting them. When Jason first showed me a redstone, it blew my mind. And you remember, yeah,
blew mine too.
And you remember,
it wasn't weathered. That's what they used to look like 12,000 years ago.
Right. And again, Jason bringing us, he and I came to the university and met you, Dr. Goodyear. I'll count those among my fondest memories. Walking to a Starbucks to get a coffee with you and talking about all this, and it was at that moment, guys, I realized, oh boy, wow, this is something big.
Well, I'm sure Chris feels the same way, but we need to kind of let the public in on what we're doing, and there's a practical side to it, in that for certain kinds of studies, we really need their help, whether it's looking at private collections or them discovering a site and letting us go look at it, like Topper, or borrowing their fluted points so Chris can do the blood residue. I see it as a big team, ideally. Yeah. Different roles for sure, but I think we need a lot of help from the public to really get this right, because it's an immense question.
Right, and we do want to be sure to make sure that we work with the public correctly in terms of really educating and explaining them how to do it properly. How to do it ethically, how to not destroy or damage their archaeological record. That's something that's also really important. We're not really interested in, people going out and looting and destroying artifacts, because they're excavating them in ways that aren't really going to allow us to do the types of analyses and science that trained archaeologists are able to do. And so that's also something that, we don't want to certainly promote the idea that people should just go out and dig up artifacts for the sake of finding artifacts. But we certainly want to work with responsible and with avocationalists, that are really interested in learning about the past and sharing that information. And that's something that we can't stop doing that.
Right.
There has to be a mutual respect for the sites, for the artifacts, and we're trying to get everyone on the same page here. And speaking of getting on the same page, again, the book is out right now. It's called Early Human Life on the Southeastern Coastal Plain. Guys, can you give us a link, or listeners can find this book? And also, Chris, can you give a link to Prehistoric Chipstone Tools of South Carolina as well?
Yeah, the Early Human Life on the Southeastern Coastal Plain is available. It's actually available on Amazon, but it's also available at the University Florida Press. It's at upf.com. If you go to their website, you can type in the name Early Human Life on the Southeastern Coastal Plain, and you can find a link to purchase the book. The Stone Tools, Prehistoric Chipstone Tools book I did with Tommy Charles is available really only on Amazon. If you go into Amazon and type in the title of the book, again, Prehistoric Chipstone Tools of South Carolina, you can find a link very easily to that book. It's $35. The proceeds of the sales of the book go to support the Piedmont Archaeological Studies Trust of South Carolina, which in turn supports research in the upstate.
Wonderful indeed. As it's almost last call here at the Cross Time Pub, anybody have any closing thoughts?
No, we've enjoyed it, and we enjoy hanging around with you guys. Turns out you're interested in a lot of the same stuff we are, so what's not to like?
Funny how that works, huh?
Right.
Yeah, right. Jason, you can bring me all the redstones you want, just whenever you're ready.
Oh, we'll be looking for some more. Don't worry. If we can just get the river water levels to drop, guys.
Yeah, right.
That's right.
We've been working on that. Well, thank you both for being here. It's been truly our pleasure having you, and we hope to have you back. Keep us up to date on what you're doing. You'll be seeing us again soon.
Will do.
Very good.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate it.
What an incredible interview. Again, we just want to thank Dr. Albert Goodyear and Dr. Chris Moore for their time. Wish we could have recorded some of our conversations out at White Pond and some of the others that we've had over there at the University of South Carolina over time. But I tell you, I think we covered most of it in this conversation. Again, both of those opportunities that we had at both White Pond and Topper were top of my list for last year, or the beginning part of this year, rather. And I'm looking forward to working with these gentlemen more in the future.
That's true. Although I might say that if we had tried to record any of the conversation while we're out there with them in the field, it might have been hard to make out what we were saying. I mean, there was a lot of wind blowing, as memory serves. I was trying to find a funny soundbite of some wind blowing. I thought I once had one of those. I must have gotten rid of it or something. But anyway, you know what I mean when I say it was cold, it was windy, and microphones don't like cold and windy. They can handle cold. They can even handle water sometimes if you've got a hydrophone. But when there's wind blowing, try and do an interview with that. Yeah, it
was quite breezy out there.
Well, we always have the cabin, right?
Yeah. I wish we could have recorded some of the conversation we had after the end of the workday that one day, where we rolled out some maps on the table and we talked about the Carolina Bays. We talked about a ton of stuff. It was fantastic. I had a great time. So
it really was. Although actually, all things considered, there were certain parts of that which we did have the cameras rolling, and we did actually have some audio too. So once again, I mean, in the future, I'm sure there'll be plenty more to come from those two gentlemen, and of course our ongoing efforts in the field. That's a lot of what we like to do is while we're on site. And fortunately, Dr. Moore, who was overseeing that dig, and Dr. Goodyear also, they're really receptive to us bringing cameras and audio equipment out there into the field. At one point, one of the actual DNR representatives there on site, Tarek, had mentioned that. I was working the camera, and I said, I don't want you guys to think I'm not working. And he says, well, I mean, you guys documenting what we're doing is kind of why you're here. And it was also mirrored in the interview there with Dr. Goodyear when he said, I mean, we professionals in the field, we kind of got to keep the public aware of what we're doing. And so we're really, really fortunate, I think, to be working with people who see the role that we play in this as not only documentarian, but also as the conduit through which the public is able to learn about what archaeologists are doing in the field. So we were really pleased to be able to be out there spending time with them. And we're even more pleased to be able to have them come into our realm, so to speak. Join us here in the Cross Time Pub as we catch up every couple of weeks or so to look at history, archaeology, and really the human condition in total. So, gentlemen, I sincerely hope that the taps haven't quite run dry. And if we've got time before last call, let's pony up one more time and enjoy our time together here.
I've never known the taps to run dry in the Crosstown Pub, Micah.
The well is bottomless, as are the subjects which we could discuss on this program. So on behalf of Mr. Pentrail, Mr. Waldo, and of course yours truly, Micah Hanks, signing off. Once again, we'll catch you guys next time here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.